August 17, 1943. Over the industrial heartland of Germany, the sky turned into a graveyard. American bomber crews watched their friends burn an aircraft that were supposed to be indestructible. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress carried more defensive firepower than any bomber in history. 16 .50 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle. The name itself was a promise: you cannot touch us. German fighter pilots had heard the stories, seen the gun barrels glinting in formation, felt the tracers rip past their cockpits. Many believed the Americans had built something new in warfare, a bomber that could defend itself all the way to the target and back. But on that summer morning, 60 miles from Schweinfurt, that belief shattered. The fortresses that fell behind died first. Alone, separated from the protection of the formation, they became what every fortress becomes without its walls: just another target. The war was supposed to be won by machines and firepower. Instead, it would be decided by something far more fragile: the discipline to stay together when everything inside you screamed to break away and run. Before we go further, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're new here, hit subscribe so you never miss our next story. The Boeing B-17 entered service with the United States Army Air Forces in 1938, 5 years before the first American bombs would fall on German soil. Its designers at Boeing believed they had solved the central problem of strategic bombing: how to strike deep into enemy territory without fighter escort. The answer was firepower. Early models carried 5 machine guns. By 1943, the G model bristled with 13, later increased to 16 in some configurations. Waist gunners, ball turret gunners, tail gunners, top turret gunners, every approach vector covered by overlapping fields of fire. The theory was elegant. If bombers flew in tight formation, their combined firepower would create a defensive sphere so lethal that enemy fighters would be forced to attack from beyond effective range, making accurate gunnery nearly impossible. The 8th Air Force, stationed across England, built its entire strategic doctrine on this assumption. Thousands of young men, average age 22, climbed into these aircraft believing the numbers would protect them. 10 guns per bomber, multiplied by 30 bombers in a group, equaled 300 gun barrels defending a single formation. On paper, it was a mathematical certainty. In practice, it required something mathematics could not account for: human endurance under conditions that broke men faster than metal. The first test came early. On August 17, 1942, exactly 1 year before Schweinfurt, 12 B-17s attacked the Rouen-Sotteville rail yards in occupied France. The mission was a statement of intent, a demonstration that American bombers could strike targets in broad daylight with precision the British night bombers could not achieve. The formation held. German fighters appeared but kept their distance, wary of the defensive fire. All 12 bombers returned. The Americans declared the doctrine validated. What they did not understand yet was that the Luftwaffe had been learning, studying, calculating. German fighter pilots returned to their bases and reported what they had seen. The bombers flew straight and level on their bombing runs, predictable, locked into their approach. The formations were tight, yes, but tight formations required discipline, coordination, and crews who had trained together for months. Any bomber that fell out of position, damaged or struggling, became isolated. And isolation, the German pilots realized, was the vulnerability they had been searching for. By early 1943, the 8th Air Force had expanded rapidly. New groups arrived from the United States every month, their crews fresh from training schools in Texas and Florida, most with fewer than 20 hours in formation flying. They were placed into combat groups alongside veterans who had survived the early missions, creating uneven formations where inexperienced pilots struggled to hold position. The strain showed immediately. Formation flying in combat was nothing like the practice runs over empty American deserts. The bombers flew at 25,000 feet where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen masks froze to faces. Machine guns jammed from the cold. Turbulence from neighboring aircraft threw planes around the sky. Pilots fought their controls for hours, muscles cramping, vision narrowing, trying to hold their position within 50 feet of the aircraft beside them, while watching for enemy fighters and listening to radio chatter that crackled with warnings and screams. The physical toll was immediate and measurable. After 4 hours in formation, most pilots could barely move their hands. The mental toll was harder to quantify, but more dangerous. Formation discipline required crews to suppress every survival instinct. When fighters attacked, when flak burst around them, when the bomber ahead exploded and debris tore through their formation, the natural human response was to break away, to dive, to take evasive action. But evasive action meant leaving the formation, and leaving the formation meant death. The Luftwaffe had studied this psychology carefully. They understood that crew morale, not defensive firepower, was the true weakness of the American bomber formations. On June 22, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched its deepest penetration yet into German airspace, a raid on a synthetic rubber plant at Hulls in the Ruhr Valley. The route took the bombers over the most heavily defended industrial region in Europe, through layers of flak batteries and fighter bases. The formations launched from England in good order, but over the continent, the strain began to show. One bomber, hit by flak over the Belgian coast, dropped out of formation trailing smoke. The crew fought to keep altitude, hoping to make it back across the channel. German fighters fell on them within minutes. The bomber broke apart at 20,000 feet. Only 2 parachutes were seen. The formation flew on. This was the rule. Never break formation to protect a damaged aircraft. The formation must survive. Individual bombers were expendable. This logic saved groups but condemned crews, and every man and every bomber understood that if his aircraft faltered, the formation would leave him behind without hesitation. The Hulls raid lost 16 bombers. Most were aircraft that had suffered damage over the target and could not maintain formation speed on the return flight. They fell behind one by one, and the Luftwaffe picked them off methodically. Some crews tried to make it home alone, flying low and fast, hoping to outrun the fighters. None succeeded. Others turned toward neutral Sweden or Switzerland, hoping to reach internment before the fighters caught them. A few made it, most did not. The survivors who landed back in England climbed out of their aircraft shaking, some weeping, others silent. They had watched friends die and had been powerless to help. The doctrine said, stay in formation. The doctrine said the formation protects everyone. But the doctrine had not prepared them for the moment when staying in formation meant watching a crippled bomber, full of men you knew, fall away to certain death while you flew straight ahead, pretending not to see. The summer of 1943 brought a shift in German tactics that would prove devastating. Luftwaffe fighter commanders, analyzing combat reports from dozens of engagements, identified a pattern. American formations were weakest at the front. The nose of a B-17 carried fewer guns than any other position. Early models had only a single .30 caliber machine gun in the nose, utterly inadequate against a fighter making a head-on attack at closing speeds of 500 miles per hour. The Americans had tried to compensate by adding cheap guns, but these were handheld weapons that required the bombardier or navigator to aim and fire while the aircraft bucked through turbulence and combat maneuvers. Against a fighter diving from 12 o'clock high, coming straight at the formation with all guns firing, these nose guns were nearly useless. German pilots began to exploit this weakness with ruthless efficiency. The head-on attack required courage that bordered on madness. A Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 would climb above the bomber formation, roll inverted, and dive straight down at the lead aircraft. The closing speed gave both sides less than 2 seconds to aim and fire. For the bomber crews, those 2 seconds were an eternity of terror. They could see the fighter coming, watch the gun flashes along its wings, feel the aircraft shudder as cannon shells tore through aluminum skin. Some crews broke at that moment, the pilot throwing the aircraft into a dive or turn, anything to evade the attack. But breaking meant leaving the formation, and once outside the protective umbrella of overlapping fire, a bomber rarely survived more than a few minutes. The pilots who held formation, who flew straight into the attacking fighter, who trusted that someone in the formation would hit the enemy before the enemy hit them. Those men displayed a kind of courage that defied normal human psychology. The German pilots faced their own terror. Diving at a formation meant flying into a wall of tracers, knowing that dozens of gunners were tracking your approach, calculating your speed, leading your aircraft by fractions of a second. Many fighter pilots were shot down during head-on attacks, their aircraft disintegrating as they closed a firing range. Others lost their nerve at the last moment and pulled up early, their shots going wide. But the ones who held their course, who kept their finger on the trigger until they had to wrench the stick back to avoid collision, those pilots did terrible damage. A 2-second burst from 4 20mm cannons could saw the nose off a B-17, kill the pilots, or sever control cables. If the fighter pilot was skilled or lucky, a single pass could destroy a bomber. More often, the damage was cumulative. One engine out, hydraulics failing, crew members wounded, oxygen systems compromised. The bomber would struggle to hold position, fall behind, and become the target for the next wave of attacks. By July 1943, the head-on attack had become standard Luftwaffe doctrine. Fighter groups stationed in France, Belgium, and Germany drilled the maneuver until it became reflexive. The Americans responded by strengthening the nose armament of the B-17, adding a chin turret with twin 50-caliber guns on the G model. But the new aircraft took months to reach operational squadrons, and in the meantime, crews flew the older models with their vulnerable noses into increasingly lethal airspace. The psychological pressure mounted with each mission. Crews knew that the moment they crossed the enemy coast, they were entering a killing zone where fighters would hit them from the one direction they could least defend. Some men broke before they ever saw combat, grounded by flight surgeons who recognized the signs of incipient collapse. Others made it through a few missions, then froze at the controls or abandoned their stations. The ones who survived learned to master their fear, not eliminate it, channeling terror into focus, into the mechanical routine of holding formation and trusting the men around them. The loss rates told the story with brutal clarity. In the first 6 months of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 188 heavy bombers in combat. In July alone, they lost 100. In August, the losses would climb higher still. Each bomber carried 10 men. Each loss meant 10 families receiving telegrams, 10 names added to the growing casualty list that filled entire pages of American newspapers. The arithmetic was unsustainable. At the current loss rate, a crew had less than a 1 in 3 chance of completing the required 25 missions to rotate home. Men calculated their odds with grim precision, counting down missions like prisoners, marking days on a cell wall. Some developed elaborate superstitions, lucky coins, ritual prayers, specific sequences of actions before takeoff. Others retreated into fatalism, convinced that survival was random and preparation meaningless. Both groups kept flying because the alternative was unthinkable. To refuse, to break, to be labeled a coward in front of the men who shared your aircraft and your fate. The planners in Washington and London understood the mathematics as clearly as the crews. Losses had to decrease, or the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse before achieving its objectives. The solution, they believed, was to strike harder, to launch larger raids that would overwhelm German defenses through sheer numbers. If 100 bombers faced determined fighter opposition, 300 bombers would spread that opposition thinner, reduce the number of attacks any single formation would face. The theory made sense on planning boards in comfortable offices far from combat. The reality would prove far more complex. Assembling 300 bombers over England in the pre-dawn darkness, organizing them into formations, coordinating their approach to the target, and bringing them home required logistics that strained the 8th Air Force to its limits, and it required something else, a target important enough to justify the losses that such a mission would inevitably incur. Schweinfurt provided that target. The town of 50,000 people in northern Bavaria housed roughly half of Germany's ball bearing production. Ball bearings were essential to virtually every piece of military equipment: aircraft engines, tank transmissions, submarine propellers, artillery traversing mechanisms. Allied intelligence estimated that destroying the Schweinfurt factories would cripple German war production for months, perhaps longer. The logic was compelling. The problem was geography. Schweinfurt lay 400 miles from the English coast, deep in southern Germany, beyond the range of any fighter escort the Allies could provide. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles alone, through airspace thick with fighter bases and flak batteries. The raid would be the ultimate test of the self-defending bomber formation concept. If the doctrine worked, if the B-17s could fight their way to the target and back without fighter protection, it would validate the entire American approach to strategic bombing. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The mission planners chose August 17, 1943 for the raid. The date marked the first anniversary of the 8th Air Force's first combat mission, a symbolic marker that was not lost on the crews. Two forces would strike simultaneously. 230 B-17s would hit Schweinfurt, while 146 bombers attacked the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The Regensburg force would continue south to North Africa after the bombing, unable to return to England due to fuel limitations. This split the German fighter defenses, but also meant that the Schweinfurt force would face the full weight of the Luftwaffe response on their return journey after the German fighters had landed, refueled, and rearmed. The plan was complex, dependent on precise timing and weather conditions. The risks were obvious. The mission was approved anyway because the target was deemed worth the cost. August 17th dawned with fog blanketing the English airfields. The Regensburg force took off on schedule, but the Schweinfurt bombers were delayed for hours while the weather cleared. This meant that instead of confusing the German defenses with simultaneous attacks, the raids came one after another, giving the Luftwaffe time to respond to both with full strength. The men who flew that day knew something had gone wrong before they left English airspace. The radio chatter was confused, the timing off, the formations struggling to assemble in visibility that remained marginal. But missions were not canceled once aircraft were airborne. The momentum of 230 bombers and 2,300 men carried them forward across the Channel, across Belgium, into Germany, toward a target they could not yet see and an enemy that was waiting. The German fighter controllers watched the bombers approach on radar plots and calculated their course with practiced efficiency. Schweinfurt. The target was obvious once the bomber stream's heading became clear. Fighter groups across Western Germany received the alert. Maximum effort. Every available aircraft was to engage. The Luftwaffe had been preparing for this moment, stockpiling ammunition, positioning units, training pilots in the head-on attack profile. Now they would throw everything they had at the largest American formation yet to penetrate deep into the Reich. The fighter pilots climbed into their cockpits knowing this would be the decisive test. If they could break this raid, if they could inflict losses so severe that the Americans would not dare attempt another deep penetration, the daylight bombing campaign might collapse entirely. The first fighter attacks hit the Schweinfurt formation west of the German border, shortly after the escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, reached their maximum range and turned back. The transition was abrupt and terrifying. One moment, the bombers flew with friendly fighters weaving above and around them. The next moment, the sky was empty except for enemy aircraft diving from every angle. The formation tightened instinctively, each pilot pulling closer to his neighbors, seeking safety in proximity. The gunners scanned the sky, hands on their weapons, watching for the dark specks that would suddenly transform into fighters coming at them at impossible speeds. The radio filled with position calls, fighters at 10 o'clock high, fighters at 2 o'clock level, fighters breaking through the formation at 6 o'clock. The voices were clipped, professional at first, then more urgent as the attacks intensified. The first bomber went down 15 minutes after the escorts departed. Waist gunner Michael Aruth, flying in the 381st Bomb Group, watched it happen from 200 yards away. A Focke-Wulf 190 came head-on at the lead aircraft of the formation, guns blazing, and continued firing until collision seemed inevitable. At the last instant, the fighter pulled up and over, but not before its shells had torn through the bomber's cockpit. The B-17 nosed down, slowly at first, then steeper, falling out of formation like a wounded bird. Aruth counted 5 parachutes before the bomber disappeared into the clouds below. 5 out of 10. The formation closed the gap where the bomber had been and flew on. There was no time to watch, no time to process what had just happened. More fighters were already lining up for their attack runs. The Luftwaffe threw itself at the formation with intensity that shocked even the veteran crews. Fighters attacked in waves, coming from the sun when they could, diving from high altitude, making coordinated passes that overwhelmed the gunners' ability to track and engage. Some German pilots flew so close that bomber crews could see their faces through the canopy glass. Others fired from maximum range, launching rockets that arced toward the formation, trailing smoke. The rockets were wildly inaccurate but terrifying to watch, and when one hit, the results were catastrophic. Ball turret gunner Thomas Murphy saw a rocket detonate against a bomber 3 positions ahead of him. The entire midsection of the aircraft vanished in an orange flash. The wings and tail section tumbled separately toward the earth. No parachutes. The bombers fought back with everything they had. Gunners fired thousands of rounds, their barrels overheating, their shoulders bruised from the weapon's recoil. Some claimed hits, seeing fighters trail smoke or spin out of control. Others fired blindly into the massive attacking aircraft, hoping volume would compensate for precision. The noise was overwhelming. The roar of engines, the hammering of machine guns, the crack of cannon shells punching through aluminum, the rush of wind through holes torn in the fuselage. Men shouted into the intercom, warning of new attacks, calling for help, reporting damage. The pilot and co-pilot wrestled with controls that grew heavier as hydraulic lines were severed and control surfaces damaged. Every few minutes, another bomber would fall out of formation, and the pattern would repeat. A brief moment of watching, counting parachutes, then back to the immediate crisis of staying alive through the next attack. The formation reached Schweinfurt at 1:45 p.m., more than 3 hours after crossing into German airspace. The city appeared through breaks in the clouds, its factories clearly visible to the bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites. This was the moment that justified everything. The reason for the losses, the terror, the exhaustion. The bomb bay doors opened. The aircraft steadied on their final approach, flying straight and level, while flak batteries below filled the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. The bombardiers made their final adjustments, watching the target creep into the crosshairs of their sights. The lead bombardier toggled his release, and 30 tons of high explosive fell away from the formation. The other bombardiers followed instantly, their bombs salvoing from the bays in a carefully timed sequence designed to saturate the target area. The bombs fell for 40 seconds, silent, dropping through the thin air toward the factories below. The results were impossible to assess in the moment. Smoke and dust obscured the target within seconds of the first impacts. Crews reported seeing explosions and fires, but whether the bombs had hit the ball-bearing plants specifically or simply devastated the city in general was unclear. The bomb run had taken 3 minutes. 3 minutes of flying straight while flak burst around them and fighters pressed home their attacks without fear of being hit by their own anti-aircraft fire. 2 bombers were lost during the bomb run, one to flak and one to a fighter that made a near-suicidal attack through the flak barrage. The formation closed up again, turned west toward home, and faced the reality that they still had to fly 400 miles through German airspace before reaching the safety of the English coast. The return flight was worse than the approach. The German fighters had landed, refueled, and rearmed while the bombers were over the target. Now they returned with full ammunition loads and coordinated tactics refined during the morning's engagement. The Luftwaffe commanders had identified the weakest groups in the American formation, those that had already suffered damage and losses, those where the formations were ragged and defensive fire less coordinated. They directed their fighters to concentrate on these vulnerable groups, to attack the same formations repeatedly until they broke apart. The strategy was brutally effective. One by one, bombers that had been hit over the target and were struggling to keep up found themselves unable to maintain formation speed. They fell behind, and the fighters swarmed them. Lieutenant William Cabral piloted a B-17 named Liberty Run in the 379th Bomb Group. His aircraft had taken damage over Schweinfurt, one engine out, hydraulics damaged, several crew members wounded. He fought to hold position in the formation, pushing his remaining engines to the red line, but the bomber was losing airspeed minute by minute. His co-pilot called out their position, 500 feet behind the formation, then 1,000 feet, then 2,000. Cabral could see the other bombers pulling away, and he knew what was coming. The fighters would notice the straggler, and they would attack until Liberty Run either went down or the crew bailed out. He had a choice: abandon the aircraft now, while they still had altitude and let the men parachute into captivity, or stay with the formation as long as possible and hope they could make it home. Cabral chose to keep flying. For another 20 minutes, Liberty Run held on, slowly falling further behind but still visible to the main formation. Then the fighters came. 4 Messerschmitt 109s, diving from above, attacking in sequence. The first pass killed the top turret gunner and knocked out another engine. The second pass wounded the tail gunner and set fire to the oxygen system in the radio room. The third pass severed the elevator cables, leaving Cabral with almost no pitch control. After the fourth pass, he gave the order to bail out. 8 men jumped. Cabral and his co-pilot stayed with the aircraft, trying to control the descent enough that the men on the ground would have a chance. Liberty Run hit the ground near the German town of Neunkirchen at 300 miles per hour. Both pilots died on impact. The formation flew on. From his position as a waist gunner in another aircraft, Robert Morgan watched Liberty Run's final moments and knew there was nothing anyone could do. The formation could not slow down, could not break off to provide cover, could not do anything except maintain course and speed and hope that by staying together, the rest of them might survive. This was the terrible calculus of formation flying. The group was more important than any individual aircraft, and protecting the group meant abandoning those who fell behind. Morgan had known Cabral, had played cards with him the night before the mission. Now Cabral was gone, and Morgan was still flying, and the only way to honor that sacrifice was to stay in formation and make it home. The fighter attacks continued for another hour, waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs hitting the formation from every angle. The Americans fought back with diminishing effectiveness as ammunition ran low, and gun barrels wore out from continuous firing. Some guns jammed and could not be cleared. Others simply ran out of ammunition. Gunners sat at their stations watching fighters approach, unable to shoot, reduced to spectators at their own potential destruction. The formation gradually disintegrated as more bombers were shot down or dropped out with damage. What had started as a tight, disciplined formation of 230 bombers fragmented into smaller groups and individual aircraft, each fighting to reach the relative safety of the German border. The Belgian coast appeared ahead at 4:30 p.m. The surviving bombers were scattered across 50 miles of sky, some in groups of 10 or 20, others alone, all racing for the channel. The German fighters pressed their attacks until the last possible moment, breaking off only when they reached the limit of their fuel range. The final bomber lost to fighters went down 10 miles from the coast, so close to safety that the crew could see the white cliffs across the water. A Focke-Wulf 190 made a single pass, set the bomber on fire, and turned back toward Germany. The B-17 hit the water at high speed. There were no survivors. The aircraft that made it across the channel began landing at their bases across England shortly after 5 p.m. Ground crews who had watched 230 bombers take off that morning counted them back one by one, and the numbers told a story that needed no elaboration. The 381st Bomb Group lost 11 out of 20 aircraft. The 91st lost 10 out of 21. The 351st lost 8. Across all groups, 60 bombers failed to return. Another 60% of the returning aircraft were damaged, many so severely they would never fly again. Of the 2,300 men who had taken off that morning, 600 were missing, killed, captured, or interned in neutral countries. Another 100 were wounded, some critically. The crews who survived climbed out of their aircraft and stood on the tarmac in silence. Some shook uncontrollably from cold and shock. Others sat on the ground and stared at nothing. The debriefing officers approached with their clipboards and questions, trying to compile combat reports while memories were fresh, but many crews could barely speak. What they had experienced defied easy description. 8 hours of continuous terror, watching friends die, believing at multiple moments that they would be next, and somehow, by luck or skill or divine intervention, making it home. The interrogators asked about fighter tactics, about flak concentrations, about bomb damage assessment. The crews answered mechanically, their minds still processing what had happened. In the officers' club that evening, the mood was subdued. Men who had flown the mission sat in small groups, drinking in silence or speaking in low voices about specific moments. The bomber that exploded, the fighter that came so close they could see the pilot's face, the endless minutes over the target when time seemed to stop. Those who had not flown the mission, who were scheduled for tomorrow or the next day, listened and understood that what they heard was their own future. The losses at Schweinfurt were not an aberration. They were the new reality of deep penetration missions without fighter escort, and the mission planners were already drawing up target lists for the next raid. The strategic results of the Schweinfurt raid emerged slowly. Reconnaissance photos taken days later showed extensive damage to the ball-bearing factories, with production estimates dropping by 34%. But the Germans proved remarkably resilient at dispersing production, hiding reserves, and repairing damage. Within 2 months, ball-bearing output had recovered to near pre-raid levels. The tactical results were clearer and more immediate. The 8th Air Force could not sustain losses at the Schweinfurt rate. 60 bombers lost in a single mission was 26% of the attacking force. At that rate, the entire bomber strength of the 8th Air Force would be destroyed in less than 4 missions. Something had to change. The question was what? The bombers themselves were not the problem. The B-17 had proven remarkably tough, capable of absorbing tremendous damage and still flying. Dozens of bombers returned to England with holes large enough to climb through, with engines out, with control surfaces shredded, and still they flew. The defensive armament, while not the impenetrable shield that pre-war doctrine had imagined, was effective enough when the formation held together. The problem was the formation itself. Maintaining formation discipline required superhuman endurance over distances that exhausted even the most experienced crews. The newer crews, rushed through training and thrown into combat with minimal formation flying experience, struggled to hold position under the best conditions. Under attack, with aircraft damaged and crew members wounded, the formations fell apart. The answer, obvious in retrospect but resisted by doctrine and pride, was fighter escort. Long-range fighters that could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back would fundamentally change the tactical equation. German fighters would have to fight through the escorts to reach the bombers, and even when they did, they would face harassment from behind that would make accurate attacks nearly impossible. The problem was that in August 1943, no such fighter existed in operational service. The P-47 Thunderbolt had the armament and durability for escort duty, but lacked the range to reach targets deep in Germany. The P-38 Lightning had better range, but suffered mechanical problems at high altitude. The P-51 Mustang, which would eventually solve the escort problem, was just beginning to enter service and would not be available in significant numbers for months. Until the escort problem was solved, the 8th Air Force faced an impossible choice: continue deep penetration raids and accept unsustainable losses, or restrict operations to targets within fighter range and abandon the strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to destroy Germany's war-making capacity from the air. The decision was made at levels far above the crews who would execute it. The raids would continue. Schweinfurt would be struck again. The losses would continue. And the men would keep flying because they had volunteered for this, because their friends were flying, because to refuse was unthinkable, and because somewhere in the logic of total war, their sacrifice was deemed necessary. The second Schweinfurt raid came on October 14, 1943, less than 2 months after the first. The target was the same. The ball-bearing factories that intelligence still insisted were critical to German war production. The force was larger, 291 bombers launched from England, hoping that greater numbers would spread the fighter defenses thinner. The result was worse. The Luftwaffe had spent 2 months refining its tactics, concentrating its fighter groups, and preparing for exactly this kind of raid. They hit the formation with coordinated attacks that began over the Belgian coast and continued without pause until the bombers reached the target and throughout the return flight. The formation discipline that had barely held at Schweinfurt in August collapsed under the sustained assault. Bombers fell out of formation in 1s and 2s, and the fighters destroyed them methodically. The second Schweinfurt raid lost 60 bombers, matching the first raid's total despite launching with more aircraft. Another 17 bombers were so badly damaged they never flew again. The loss rate was 21%, and when combined with the damaged aircraft, 26% of the force was effectively destroyed. More than 600 men were lost. The 8th Air Force reached its breaking point. Deep penetration missions were suspended indefinitely. The self-defending bomber formation concept, the doctrine that had driven American strategic bombing policy for 5 years, was dead. The bombers would not return to Schweinfurt until February 1944, when they would be escorted by P-51 Mustangs flying all the way to the target and back. The men who flew Schweinfurt carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. In the immediate aftermath, they returned to their barracks and tried to process what had happened. Some wrote letters home, carefully vague about details but honest about the fear. Others said nothing, finding that words could not capture the reality of 8 hours in combat. The official casualty notices went out to families across America. Missing in action, presumed killed, prisoner of war. The telegrams arrived at farmhouses in Iowa, in apartments in New York, and parents and wives and children learned that the war that had seemed distant and abstract was now personal and final. The survivors faced a different burden. They had to keep flying. The 25 mission requirement for rotation home remained in effect, and most crews who survived Schweinfurt had fewer than 10 missions completed. They faced 15 more trips into German airspace, 15 more opportunities to die or watch their friends die. The psychological toll was measurable. Flight surgeons began diagnosing combat fatigue in men who had seemed fine weeks earlier. Some crews were grounded after breaking down during missions, freezing at their positions or refusing to fly. Others made it through their tour and went home, only to find that home no longer made sense, that the people there could not understand what they had experienced, and that the normal concerns of daily life seemed trivial compared to the existential clarity of combat. The German fighter pilots who had fought at Schweinfurt faced their own reckoning. They had won a tactical victory, destroying more than 100 American bombers across the two raids. But the cost in pilots and aircraft was mounting. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than the training schools could replace them. Many of the men who had shot down B-17s over Schweinfurt would themselves be dead within a year, killed in combat or accidents as the air war intensified. The Americans kept coming, with more bombers, better tactics, and eventually fighters that could outfight anything the Germans had. The victory at Schweinfurt bought time but did not change the strategic trajectory of the war. In the years after the war, historians and strategists debated whether Schweinfurt had been worth the cost. The ball-bearing factories were damaged but not destroyed. German production recovered quickly. The strategic impact was negligible. But the tactical lessons learned at Schweinfurt, the necessity of fighter escort, the limits of formation discipline, the importance of crew training and experience, shaped American air doctrine for decades. The men who died over Schweinfurt did not die in vain if their sacrifice taught lessons that saved lives in future conflicts. But that kind of calculus offers cold comfort to the families who received the telegrams and the crews who watched their friends burn. The legacy of Schweinfurt is written in the memorial walls at American cemeteries across Europe, in the rows of white crosses marking the graves of men who were 22 years old when they died. It is written in the mission reports and combat diaries preserved in archives, clinical descriptions of chaos and terror. It is written in the memories of the survivors, fewer each year, who remember what it was like to fly into German airspace in an aircraft named a Fortress that turned out to be more vulnerable than anyone had imagined. The name promised safety. The reality delivered something different, a test of endurance, of courage, of the ability to function under conditions that broke many and scarred all. The war continued for another 20 months after the second Schweinfurt raid. The bombers returned to German skies, but now they flew with fighter escort, and the loss rates dropped to sustainable levels. The strategic bombing campaign achieved some of its objectives, disrupting German production, forcing the Luftwaffe to dedicate resources to home defense, demonstrating Allied resolve. Whether it shortened the war or justified its cost remains debated. What is certain is that the men who flew those missions did what was asked of them, knowing the odds, accepting the risks, and trusting that their sacrifice served a purpose larger than their individual survival. August 17, 1943 marks a turning point in that story. The day the Flying Fortresses discovered that 16 guns and a confident name were not enough to protect them when they fell behind, when they broke formation, when they faced an enemy that had learned to exploit their weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. The formations that survived learned to hold together at any cost, to suppress every instinct to break away and save themselves, to trust in the collective strength of men flying too, close together in aircraft too fragile for the task they had been given. Some made it home, many did not. All of them understood, by the end of that day, that the war would be won not by machines or firepower, but by the capacity of ordinary men to endure the unbearable and keep flying into the fire.